Hello, and welcome to today's live reading of Dream Shifter by Lois Wickstrom, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, Tuesday, August 24th, Out of the Bowl. When the fishbowl got to Gwendolyn, she pulled out a folded paper and read, Funeral Director. She'd never known anybody who died. The idea of being permanently gone, dead, scared her. She didn't want to admit that, even to herself. She dangled the slip of paper from her fingernails as she stage whispered a disdainful, gross. The word didn't have its usual calming powers. She had to think of something else. She looked around the classroom to see if anybody was watching her. The classroom was laid out like the New York Times newsroom, with rows of desks across the middle and rows of computer stations along the walls. This layout gave more privacy than a typical classroom. The only person who could have been watching her freak out was the boy sitting next to her, Wally. He would never tell. Still, she didn't want him to know how frightened she felt. She grimaced and held the bowl out daintily, in her best imitation of a Victorian poet. That was her favorite look. She parted her dark hair down the middle and braided it low on her neck, just like Emily Dickinson. Wally laughed. You can't pretend to be normal with me. I know you like to look under bandages. Wally always pointed out the truth. She did like looking under bandages because beneath the bloody goo, healing was happening. Their teacher, Mrs. Sawyer, interrupted. Good reporters are always looking under bandages. A great humanitarian might be covering up for something she did when she was younger. If you do your job right, you'll find the wounds. She glared around the room. You are in middle school now. It's time you outgrew being squeamish. Her classmates murmured and shook their heads. Gwendolyn grinned at Wally and handed him the bowl. The button on her cufflink clinked against the glass. Wally gave her the look that said, if you didn't dress so weirdly, you wouldn't make funny noises. She adjusted her long skirt and pretended she hadn't noticed. Wally unfolded his paper and grinned. Then he pretended to hide it from her. Did you get the invisible man? She asked. She liked to tease Wally about that wearing a tan shirt and blue jeans every day made him blend in with the wallpaper, making him nearly invisible, or at least forgettable. Better, he crowed. Magician. I loved the birthday party magician when I was a kid. Maybe if I ask the right questions, he'll tell me some of his secrets. Mrs. Sawyer, their journalism teacher, cleared her throat and walked menacingly down the aisle, close enough that Gwendolyn could detect her faint smell of nervous sweat. This isn't chat time. Before you go to your screens to start surfing, I want to remind you to turn in your applications for this summer's journalism camp by the end of school day today. Students who go will be guaranteed a spot on the yearbook staff for next year. Come cheer for me at the Broad Street race this weekend, said Gwendolyn. I need the prize money for camp. She had already turned in her application. Now she needed to raise the money to pay for it. Go to your screens to find your interviewees. Your profile interviews are due next week. After hearing 15 variations of, I don't have time for a middle school wannabe journalist, on her 16th call, Gwendolyn heard, Hello, mortal. You have reached Burns' funeral parlor. The voice on the phone would have been perfect for a haunted house. Inviting, but dangerous. If voice tones could lure you in and then zap like a taser, this funeral director's would. For the 16th time, Gwendolyn said, I'm a middle school journalism student, and my teacher assigned me to interview a funeral director. May I come over after school today and ask you some questions? Unlike the other 15 times, the witchy woman said, Yes, but you're not going to see any dead people, mortal, if that's what you're after. Chapter 2, Dead Bodies Inside. Burns' funeral parlor looked like an ordinary house, with rose bushes along the walk and a business sign out front. Gwendolyn loved rose petal jam and rose hip tea. She made a mental note to come back here after frost when the rose hips would be at their tastiest. Unless the director really was a witch, she probably left the rose hips to rot on the branches rather than harvest them. Gwendolyn lifted the skull-shaped knocker and let it thunk against the shiny brass plate. The heavy wooden door sprung open. Had her knocking triggered a trap? Gwendolyn looked around warily. The entry room reminded her of a museum, trying to be friendly but meticulously clean. The air smelled of fresh cut pine rather than rotting bodies or embalming fluid, like she had imagined. A few plush couches were positioned against the walls under prints of geometric Escher paintings. Trays of nibble sized sandwiches, fruit slices, small cakes, and creamy candies covered the glass top buffet table in the middle of the room. Maybe the gingerbread house had tempted those unlucky kids like this. That's how the sneaky witch caught them. Feeling daring, she reached for a cucumber sandwich. Just one, mortal, said the eerie voice she recognized from the phone. Gwendolyn startled and turned. The speaker's long flowing dress reminded her of Morticia from the Addams family, but unlike Morticia, this woman was plump and wore her hair in dreadlocks. Her skin matched the ebony wood of the dessert tray. Snacks are for customers. I thought your customers were all dead, said Gwendolyn. She quickly nibbled the crispy sandwich before the weird woman could change her mind. Good one, mortal. The owner's voice now took on a subtle laugh. I'm Marjorie Burns. Perhaps you'll be one of my customers in the future. You think I'm going to die soon? Gwendolyn asked. Again, she felt a clutch at her heart, like she had when she knew she had to come here. Everybody dies. My customers are the family members whose dead we handle. You aren't bringing me anybody dead. At least not today. So, you're not a customer. You're a moocher. And you're the reporter who called on the phone. Which do you want to see first? The cooker, the liquefier, or the green burial shrouds? Gwendolyn looked around. Did this funeral home do double duty as a ghost house? Was this spookily dressed woman pranking her? She got out her notepad and pen. Let's start with you telling me the whole process from the beginning. What happens when someone dies? Marjorie Burns didn't even blink. The person stops breathing. Like, duh, said Gwendolyn. Where do you come in? Most of my job is paperwork. The woman led her to a file cabinet and pulled open a drawer. I'm old fashioned. I keep computer printouts of all my records. I make sure the legal death certificates get filed. I put notices in the newspaper. Gwendolyn couldn't help herself. She blurted, That sounds boring. I thought funeral directors did ghoulish, spicy stuff. She turned her gaze to the filing cabinet, hoping Marjorie wouldn't see her flinch. Marjorie Burns nodded. Yes, that part is boring. But I have to do it so I can do the otherworldly parts. She paused. Gwendolyn didn't interrupt the silence. Mrs. Sawyer said that most people can't endure quiet and will say something interesting if the silence goes on long enough. It was hard to stay silent, but finally, Marjorie Burns spoke. It was as if she had blinked first and was finally giving a real interview. The other thing I do is talk to the bereaved. I try to convince them to sit with the body for hours, 4 days, as long as they are comfortable, before we come to pick it up. Why would they do that? Gwendolyn asked, excited. I'll have to tell Miss Sawyer her trick really works. Marjorie warmed to her topic. They get to watch their loved one's body start to decay. They appreciate that this person, whom they knew, whom they loved, is no longer living. They get a real sense not only of their loved one's mortality, but their own mortality as well. But what do you do? Gwendolyn persisted. What is the job of a funeral director? If my article gets published, what do you want it to say? Before Marjorie could answer, Wally burst in through the door. Ignore me. I'm just here to watch Gwendolyn ask questions. I might get some tips I can use when I do my interview with the magician. I don't need a minder, Gwendolyn pointed to the door, and I didn't invite you. She knew it was unprofessional to bring a buddy to an interview, but she was glad to have him there. She liked familiar company. Nobody needs an invitation to go into a place of business. Wally dashed over to the food table, grabbed a plate, and piled on one of everything except the pork and shrimp. He popped one after another into his mouth as if he was starving. That food is for customers, Marjorie began. Stop now. Wally continued to stack morsels on his plate. Marjorie walked over to the table and blocked Wally's progress. Wally, said Gwendolyn, is that your idea of how to make me look good by eating more than I did? I'll tell both of you mortals the same thing. The woman sounded exasperated. Go home. Do some research. Eat. And come back when you have real questions. Marjorie Burns turned her back and entered the room marked Private, Do Not Enter. The train of her black satin dress swooshed along the floor behind her. Her dreadlocks bounced with her step. Wally asked, "What's a real question?" A real question is one that you truly care about, one you need the answer to, not just some boring detail that will fill up space on a page. The voice seemed to come over a loudspeaker. Marjorie was nowhere in sight. Be sure to sign the guest book before you leave. Chapter 3, August 24th, Night. Can homework be taboo? Dad looked over her shoulder at the computer screen. His voice sounded like he was trying to make a joke. Are you looking at hope chests? Before she could answer, he took a step back. Caskets? Did one of your classmates die? His shoulders tightened and his forehead wrinkled. It's just homework, Dad. Gwendolyn smiled up at him. Yeah, he nodded. Nothing is taboo for a reporter. Even his belly relaxed and hung a little over his belt. That's what Mrs. Sawyer said. She looked over his shoulder to the art print of infinite doors in black and white. Her thoughts got lost in that picture if she stared at it long enough. When she didn't respond, he said, Let me know when you're done. I'd like to look something up too. That night, Gwendolyn took off her clothes and checked the bed frame for cracks, as she did every night. She could become heavy during her dreams. If the frame cracked and she tumbled to the floor, she could wake suddenly. That was not good. Sweet dreams, called her mother as she padded down the hallway. Gwendolyn pulled up the sheets, put her head on her pillow, and entered dreamland. If her parents hadn't told her what they'd heard and seen, she'd never have known she was a dream shifter. But one night, about 2 years ago, when she was dreaming sleep deeply, her parents heard thumping and bleeding coming from her bedroom. They called her name, but she was too sound asleep to answer. They opened her door. Instead of their sleeping daughter, they found a big horned sheep in her bed. Her father recognized what was happening right away. The next morning, he told her, I saw my mother shift in her dreams too. Sometimes she became a big creature like a walrus. Sometimes she was a dragonfly, humming as she flitted about the room. Dream shifting runs in our family. Can I wake up as my dream animal? Gwendolyn thought that might be fun. You can if you are awakened suddenly, but if you wake naturally, you'll always wake up human. So if I set an alarm clock, enjoy being an animal in your dreams. It can be tricky to return to human if you wake as an animal. My mom got stuck a few times. Once it was my fault. Before I knew about dream shifting, I saw a bear in her bed. I woke it and it clawed me. Eek! Gwendolyn felt scared right along with her father. How long did you have to live with the bear? That time I was lucky. She fell asleep soon after and woke up as my mom again. What happened when she wasn't lucky? One time she woke up as a dog, Dad continued. She got picked up by Animal Patrol. At first, we didn't know what kind of animal we were looking for. Then, it was almost impossible to identify her because she didn't dare talk. It took us days to find her, and then we had to get her a bunch of shots and licenses before they let us adopt her and take her home. She got so stressed she wasn't able to switch back for over a month. When her parents saw her as a sheep, they let her sleep, but when Gwendolyn awoke, her pajamas were in tatters. After that, she slept in the nude. When her dream came, she found herself in the woods, munching on fern fronds. She looked down. Her feet were cloven hooves, each with 2 heels. Her head bumped against a nearby tree, but she wasn't close enough to have touched it. Did she have antlers? Around her, dozens of female elk grazed on nearby bushes. None of them had antlers. Still, she must be female. She was always female in her dreams. No matter which species she became, could female elk have antlers? These nearby elk seemed like family. Gwendolyn felt a closer camaraderie with these wild creatures than she ever had with girlfriends. She liked the feeling of being with friends. Was this what it was like to be on a team? I think I'm pregnant, said a sweet-voiced elk nibbling nearby. I'm looking forward to having a little one to take care of. Clearly, the other elk saw her as female. This was girl talk. Part of her knew she was dreaming, but that meant her sleeping body also had antlers. Her father had warned her about this. Dream shifting wasn't always a perfect copy. The shapes of every creature she became were built from her memory, and memories aren't perfect. She might have antlers and still be female. Gwendolyn stopped munching. She turned and asked, "Don't you want to have adventures before you have babies?" The young elk ignored her question and bit off a mouthful of aspen leaves. Maybe this female elk didn't want adventures, but Gwendolyn wouldn't let that stop her. She looked around. No male elk were in sight. She must definitely be female. Gwendolyn leaped happily toward a smoky scented Rocky Mountain maple. A loud horn blasted. She awoke mid sleep.